Hey, how's it going, everybody? Joey0 here, and I wanted to go ahead and put together a quick little guide about Xaku. Now, just a heads up, this is a sponsored video. I did get Xaku from the Day 1 Access program, like a lot of other creators, but I've been playing Xaku a whole lot on streams lately. If you want some, I guess, a little more candid of my take on Xaku, feel free to go look through those streams. This is basically just, you know, an informational video about Xaku, a couple of build suggestions. Let's get into it. Just a heads up, if you're new to the game, there's a link in the description where you can download and get started. It's free to play, and I make a lot of videos about it, so there you go. Check out the link if you're new here. Hi, I'm Joey. Okay. So, Xaku is a Warframe made up of 3 other Warframes. That's kind of cool. Now, those aren't Warframes that we have in-game. We don't know their names. They seem to have previously fallen and are now just lost to the ages indefinitely. But through the magic of modern technology, we can reconstruct a realistic representation of what Now, Xaku is the result of a community-created Warframe project from the ground up. The theme, the aesthetic, the abilities. Xaku was built based on input from the community, starting with Yornheight's concept art. They're kind of this, like, grungy hodgepodge of parts from fallen Warframes that we get from the Entrati. Almost like they're kind of barely being held together, like a lot of what we see on Deimos. Lore-wise, there's history and identity there that seem to have been forgotten and reconstituted by circumstance into something that's altogether just kind of different, right? I feel like that's really well expressed by the frame's aesthetic, right? From the look of Xaku themselves to the weird kind of off-kilter stances that you might expect someone to adopt after having a mishmash of different-sized body parts. It's weird and it's different, and I love it. So, to get Xaku, as with a lot of other frames, you're gonna have to do some grinding. Unless, of course, you decide to pick them up from the market. If you do, you can get Xaku themselves for 325 platinum, or the bundle that includes their alt helmet, the Quasis, the Artifact Sayandana, and some boosters for 581 plat. Just, you know, throwing it out there if that's what you want to do. That's what, there it is. But if you're gonna go out and grind the parts yourself, here's what you've gotta know. First off, the actual blueprint for Xaku is a reward from completing the opening quest for Deimos, meaning that you're going to, at the very least, have completed your way from Earth through Mars to the Derelict. Once you've completed the intro quest, you can get Xaku's component blueprints from Deimos bounties. They're pretty easy to get, honestly. It took me like an afternoon. Then, you'll have to start grinding out the materials. Now, Scintillant will require doing isolation vaults, and I think it's important to mention here that the component blueprints require materials from other open world areas, right? You'll need some materials that you'll have to go get from Fortuna and Cetus, some of which will require some ranking up, so if you're new to the game and grinding out Xaku is a goal, it's best to get on that sooner rather than later. And that's it! Even if you're pretty new to the game, once you get to Deimos, you should be able to grind out all the blueprints and all the parts needed for Xaku in a day or two without much of a problem. Alright, so now we're going to go ahead and take a look at Xaku's abilities, starting with their passive. Xaku's passive gives them a 25% chance to avoid incoming attacks. In practice, this seems to lower enemy accuracy rather than giving an actual, like, avoidance chance, similar to how EMP aura affects the corpus. I could be wrong about that, that's just kind of what I found in my gameplay and in my testing and everything. While it affects seemingly every enemy type, it doesn't quite seem to do much for Xaku on its own, as you might expect a passive to do. It does not give you any chance to avoid AoE damage, like rockets, ground slams, auras, so, you know, just keep that in mind as we go through some of the other abilities. Now, let's take a look at Xaku's first ability, Zada's Whisper. This ability gives Xaku's weapon attacks some bonus elemental damage, void damage in particular. The amount of extra damage that you get is not very much, but it is enough to get your status weapons to start proccing those void status procs. Now, the void damage type and the proc are generally regarded as not being among the best of damage types, but I think it's important to take a quick look at what those void procs can do relative to Xaku, because it does give you some additional options with the rest of their kit. Namely, you can use those status procs defensively to create a bit of cover for yourself. See, when you inflict a void status proc, it creates a bubble around an enemy, kind of like a mini magnetized bubble. This bubble will redirect all incoming fire toward the enemy that's affected for a short time, including fire from that enemy themselves and from enemies behind them. In a pinch, you can use this to create cover for yourself by tagging the front line of enemies with void procs, basically creating a defensive wall behind which other enemies are unable to shoot you. Or, you can use it to tag enemies all around you with void procs, surrounding yourself with a little cocoon of cover. Again, in practice, this is a bit difficult to use consistently. You are almost never going to cover every angle of attack with this, but I'd be lying if I said it weren't a meaningful contributor to the myriad of little things that can help keep Xaku alive. Now, Grasp of Loke is Xaku's disarm ability. When you cast it, it will strip weapons from enemies in range that will kind of hover around them and shoot nearby enemies. These weapons don't do particularly meaningful damage, but the disarm can be pretty valuable. One thing to keep in mind is that both the casting range and the maximum number of enemies that it can target are affected by your range stat, up to a maximum of 16 enemies at 280% range, which is the absolute maximum range that you can have right now. It is not recastable, so generally you've got to run a pretty low duration build if you're looking to disarm consistently, or you've got to be very tactical about your casts. If you cast for a group of 16 enemies, but your teammates kill 14 of those enemies before the cast animation finishes, then you're going to be stuck with only 2 guns until the timer expires, no matter how many enemies might be right around the corner. In solo play, it's important to try to keep an eye on the timer to plan out what group of enemies you're going to try to disarm the next time that the ability's up. Again, it's very micromanagey, but it can be useful if you're willing to put in the work. Alright, so the Lost is a mix of 3 sub-abilities on Xaku's third main ability. You can toggle between them with a quick tap of the ability button, or you can hold to cast the ability. Let's go through them one by one. Now, Accuse is Xaku's best CC ability. Casting it will turn all enemies within a certain range of the casting area into allies that will fight for you. This is a bit similar to radiation procs, but it's generally a bit more consistent in that the affected enemies will not try to target you at all until the ability expires. It's a bit costly in terms of investment, with a relatively high energy cost, a long cast time, and the potential of having to toggle through sub-abilities to get to it, but the result is one of Xaku's best tools for setting up a space for themselves to do the rest of their area setup stuff, which Xaku has a lot of. One thing worth mentioning is that once you've stolen some weapons with Grasp of Loke, those weapons will not target enemies that have been converted into allies by Accuse. Right? You can still damage those allies, your teammates can damage those allies, you can still steal weapon from those allies, but your Grasp of Loke weapons will not target them. The more you know. Alright, so Gaze is Xaku's bread and butter right here. Targeting an enemy with Gaze will make them temporarily invulnerable, but that enemy will emit a debuff aura that strips armor and shields from all other nearby enemies, and this is capable of 100% defense strip. The range of this ability isn't super great, but it's enough to create a little space for yourself to start going to town on enemies. Now, while the affected enemy is invulnerable, any damage done to them will be stored and then applied once Gaze falls off, so your damage against a gazed enemy isn't necessarily wasted, but it can be difficult to know when you've done enough damage to potentially kill them. Now, you can have 2 instances of Gaze up at a time. Once you cast a third one, the first Gaze that you cast will just automatically fall off, and then if you'd like, you can cancel Gaze. You can cause it to fall off prematurely by aiming at an affected enemy and recasting. Being able to have 2 Gazes up at a time is really useful. It basically allows you to cover more of the map. It allows you to cover different entry or exit points into a tile. Just be aware that you only have 2. Also worth noting, during the Deimos bounties where you're competing with Grineer for kills, since it makes the enemy invulnerable, this is a good way to set up a distraction for the Grineer you're up against. Since they see an enemy and they don't recognize that it's invulnerable, they'll just continue to attack that same enemy while you can go around and clean up all the other enemies on your own. This same strategy also works against players. Anyway, the last of the Lost's sub-abilities, and the one that I've had the hardest time figuring out, is Deny. If I'm honest, I'm still not quite sure how I should be using this ability, but basically when you cast it, Xaku unleashes a beam of void energy from their hand that does a little bit of damage. It gives enemies the lifted status, and it resets damage resistances on sentience. With regard to the lifted status, I'm not quite sure how to use this unless it's taking you double digits of seconds to deal with a single enemy, and you just want to CC them for a short time while you deal with them. Maybe you just want to remove one heavy unit from the fight while you deal with other smaller units. I don't know, maybe you're fishing for energy orbs or something so that you can I'm not quite sure. And then there's the resetting sentient damage resistances. You could use this ability, or you could just like use the void damage from Zada's Whisper. You're probably going to be trying to keep that up the whole time anyway, so I'm not quite sure when it might be appropriate to use this ability rather than just using the void damage. And then finally, as far as the damage goes, I could really only see it actually killing things at a very low level, but then at that point, the cast time is such that by the time you've actually fired the beam, your teammates or even your companion have probably killed that enemy already. Honestly, I'm not sure. If you have any thoughts, let me know. But there you go. That's what Deny does. And finally, we come to Xaku's fourth ability, the Vast Untime. This ability is the source of Xaku's greatest strength, the spooky Void Noodle skeleton fashion. Aw yeah. Seriously, when you're fashioning Xaku, use the broken tab at the bottom to fashion for the skeleton looks, and then adjust for the looks of the rest of the frame. I love it. I don't run any armor with Xaku. Anyway, this is about the ability. Now, when this ability is cast, Xaku sheds all of their component Warframe parts in an explosion around them. Enemies that are hit by the parts in the explosion are rendered weaker to the void damage that Xaku gets from Zada's Whisper, the void damage from Grasp of Loke. Affected enemies are also slowed, and that slow scales with your power strength. So that can be pretty helpful in keeping Xaku alive in the close quarters of the area that they've set up for themselves. This brings the avoidance from Xaku's passive from 25% to 75% while active, and it gives Xaku like a tiny little extra boost to run speed. Honestly, I've just barely been able to feel the difference to run speed myself, even with like a sprint build. Moderate speed. Now, this ability really is Xaku's biggest energy guzzler, since it's both a duration-based ability that you want to be recasting and a channeled ability. Untime represents, by a pretty significant margin, the biggest issue that Xaku has with energy. Much more so if you're planning to keep this ability active for the additional survivability. We'll get more into that later, but I thought it was worth mentioning with regard to the mechanics of this ability. So let's go ahead and take a look at my suggestions for the playstyle and the build that I've been using on them. Okay, so let's get into some build suggestions. It took me a while to figure out something that I was happy with. I mean, there's the whole disarm thing, and I tried running like a minimum duration disarm build, but I just wasn't happy with it. But eventually I was able to settle on a build that I feel pretty confident bringing into Steel Path missions. One important thing that I've come to realize about Xaku is that no other frame focuses on self-buffs and enemy debuffs in quite the same way as Xaku. Now, when you view their kit from within the frame of the idea of like buffing and debuffing, a fun little playstyle emerges, right? Here's another way to think of it. Zada's Whisper, that's a self-buff for damage and defense. Grasp of Loke, that's an enemy debuff with like, sure, it's got a little bit of damage as a bonus, right? Then you have Gaze, which is a very strong enemy debuff. Then you have the Vast Untime, which is a self-buff and 2 enemy debuffs in one ability. This is witchcraft. Seriously, it's like witches in Pathfinder. They're an enemy shutdown class that works primarily with buffs and debuffs. They're not a DPR class, but they've got action economy issues, kind of like Xaku, and they can work their way to a coup de grace just about as quickly as one of the DPR classes, but that no, reference didn't, you know what, never mind. So Xaku's strength right now is in debuffing enemies and buffing themselves to the point that they're positively towering over one small section of the battlefield, wrecking enemies like they're nothing. Now, there are a lot of frames that are good at debuffs, there are a lot of frames that are good at buffs, but I think this is the first time we've actually seen a frame that exclusively just does both. Xaku's not a tanky frame, they're not really a support, they're not really a CC frame. They do 2 things well, and those 2 things are buff themselves and debuff enemies. And then they wreck face once all that's in place. You know, I don't know. Okay, so let's take a look at the gameplay loop, and then we'll take a quick look at the build. Then we'll wrap up with some shortcomings of the build and the playstyle that you'll need to keep in mind if you want to give this a shot. So, you're in mission, right? You see a pack of enemies headed your way. What do? First off, you want to open with Zada's Whisper. You're probably going to be aiming to pretty much always keep this up. It's bonus damage with low maintenance and a low cost and a reasonable duration, so you don't lose much by keeping it up anyway. This will also help you deal with stragglers later on, so again, you pretty much always want to keep it up. If the enemies are pretty far away or they're behind cover, you should be safe enough to open up with Gaze. Otherwise, I would either lead with Accuse to create a bit more of a safe opportunity to swoop in and do the rest of the casting that you're going to need, or you could use the status procs from the void damage to create a little wall for yourself, just like we did earlier. Accuse costs some more energy, and there's a little more fiddling around with having to switch abilities and everything. Using the Void status procs is a little less reliable. Both are valid, it's whatever you want to do. But just remember that Xaku isn't all that tanky, so creating a bit of a safety buffer for yourself when you need it is a thing that you should probably be trying to find opportunities to do. Now, as you approach, once you feel confident that enough enemies are in range, you can cast Grasp of Loke to disarm them, making it safer for you to get in closer. This is going to give you a bit of bonus damage, but ultimately the thing that we're after here is the disarm. Then, once you're in range, you'll want to cast the Vast Untime. This will slow enemies, which should make them a bit more docile now that you're kind of in their faces, effectively making you a little bit more tanky and making them a bit more vulnerable to your attack. Now that you've got all that set up, you've got a little space set up for yourself, you can open up with literally any weapon that you want to use here. I prefer to use a high range weapon with healing return since it'll help with your tankiness as other weapon carrying enemies are kind of reintroduced to the fight. But at this point, everybody is defenseless to whatever damage you're about to lay down, so pretty much anything will work. It doesn't take much to clear that circle that you've set up for yourself there. So once you've done that, you can either wait for new enemies to enter the area of your armor strip, which remember, you've got a disarm ability which puts you in control of where enemies are wanting to stand, or you can look for another cluster of enemies to recast Gaze on and just kind of repeat and move on. Okay, so onto the build. Now, Xaku does have some conflicting build priorities, but those aren't so egregious that they can't be played around if you're looking to make Xaku work. First off, Xaku is really squishy, so let's address that. I run Vitality because they've just got more health to work with. Next up, you can add armor or shields. My preference is for shields because barrier procs are going to reliably give you a little more value with like shield gating and everything. If you've got it, you can use Grace or Guardian. It's whatever you want to use. My preference is for barrier and shield gating. Now, personally, I opt to not use adaptation here because I feel like without the support of other defensive mods, adaptation isn't going to get you nearly as much value here as it would on other frames. I'll be discussing that more in the next section, but if you're not planning on spending a whole lot of time with Untime up, or if you feel you want to run some additional defensive mods, you go right ahead and do it. Just try to keep in mind how that might affect your gameplay. Next, we'll want to build a fix for their energy economy. Since Untime is a channeled ability that you want to be recasting regularly, Xaku's going to be guzzling all the energy they can get. As such, I found that you get the most value by running Flow, Continuity, Arcane Energize, and just running with some other energy generation tech elsewhere in the build to make up for that lack of efficiency. More on that later. We'll get to that in a minute. After that, we'll want to fill out the rest of the build for Gaze. In order to get 100% defense strip, you need to have 200% power strength. So that's Transient Fortitude, Intensify, Power Drift, and then Augur Reach and Stretch for the most range that we can get. It's worth noting that if you're willing to sacrifice 1% of that armor strip, you can still reliably get some pretty solid damage against those heavily weakened enemies while leaving that Exilus mod slot open for whatever else you'd like to run. But the important takeaway here is the 199% power strength at minimum. Anything above 200% is a bit of a waste, honestly. Anything lower than that will make for significantly stronger enemies to chew your way through. And finally, since Xaku is actually quite good at dealing with sentient enemies, I think it's worth mentioning that they would take a full Umbral build pretty well. If you have some Umbral Forma to throw at them, it could potentially make for a pretty decent investment. Just be aware that this build will be energy starved, so make sure you plan for that. Also, Xaku might get changed. Keep that in mind. I don't know that I would throw Umbral Forma at them right now, because, I mean, you know, we don't know how they're gonna get changed. Okay, that was a long walk to the well, right? Don't worry, we're almost done. I just wanted to really quickly discuss a couple of shortcomings of that playstyle in particular. We've already kind of touched on them a little bit with the build, but I thought it was worth kind of explaining a couple of things. Firstly, Xaku is squishy. Like really squishy. The damage avoidance that they get from the Vast Untime has a bit of anti-synergy with a lot of the survivability tactics that would otherwise help save most other frames in similar circumstances, right? Like, for example, adaptation. If 75% of the shots are missing you, then you're only building the defenses at a quarter of the speed that you normally would, and they're a lot more likely to fall off in the event that you don't take damage for some time. The same goes for Arcane Barrier, Arcane Grace, Arcane Guardian, you name it. If it requires you to take damage, then it's probably not going to be nearly as effective. It makes AoE damage in particular a real pain, and in general, all it takes is one damage spike to one-shot you, and that happens quite a lot. Be prepared, you're gonna get reintroduced to the ground at some point. So even if you're keeping Untime up, Xaku cannot afford to play like one of the tanky frames. As with a lot of the other squishy frames, you've got to be mindful of cover, enemy placement, all that. And that kind of brings me to my next point. This build and this playstyle, they are very micromanaging. There's a lot of setup and even more that you've got to keep in mind with regard to kind of your situational awareness. Where are the enemies, and more importantly, have they been disarmed or not? How soon will gaze be expiring? How soon will untime be expiring? Am I standing close to a wall that's gonna catch a bombard rocket? Is there a disarmed heavy gunner lurking in the crowd somewhere that's looking to knock me down? Again, Xaku can rarely afford to not be careful, even with the vast untime active, and even at relatively low levels. You've really got to be aware of enemy placement, which enemies have weapons, all that jazz. And finally, energy is a big issue with this build, which is why I've been saying on streams for the past few days that Xaku really shines in a squad that can support them. Having a teammate around that can help provide energy is absolutely invaluable if you know somebody that wants to do that. One of the biggest issues with this is the fact that untime has both a duration and an energy drain. Just so we're all clear here, if you've got untime up, you cannot benefit from Xenaric's energy overflow. You cannot get any energy from energy pads. It just turns off energy siphon. For solo play, I've been running as many additional energy restoring mechanics as I can that I know will work with channeled abilities. I prefer the Supra Vandal as one weapon that can help restore energy. The Cyanoid Gamma Core, the Cyanoid Heliocore, which synergizes really well with heavy attacks if you prefer to heal that way. Those heavy attacks, by the way, can help you get a bit of added tankiness by way of the Karnas set mods, if that's what you want to do. There's also Death Cube's Energy Generator, and of course, Arcane Energize, even with a high efficiency, high duration build. And I think that's mostly because Untime just has so much energy that it eats through. It's one of those abilities that really wants you to have strength and range and efficiency and duration and cast speed. Now, I do feel like those issues are pretty glaring. As I said before, I do feel pretty confident that DE will make some positive adjustments to Xaku in the future, since that's been the trend lately. This isn't intended to be like a feedback video. This isn't meant to be like, oh, here's how I would change Xaku video or anything like that. If you're interested in that stuff, again, I've been pretty candid about my thoughts and feelings about Xaku and their builds. Feel free to check those out if you want, but I don't know, maybe DE will make some like game-changingly radical changes to Xaku, but I do hope the DE builds on this playstyle rather than completely reworking Xaku. I think Xaku has a lot of potential, and I feel like they have a lot to contribute to high-level squad-based gameplay, and I really do enjoy this playstyle even if it is a bit difficult. So that's it. I hope this video has been helpful. If you have any build suggestions, maybe you found some cool synergy with Xaku that I haven't, and I would love to hear about it. Make sure to leave a comment down below with some of your thoughts, or feel free to drop by a live stream sometime and tell me what you think. I would love to see you there. I'd love to have a discussion. And before I wrap up, I just want to say thanks to DE for giving me the opportunity to make this video. Personally, I love the aesthetic, and I think Xaku's got some real potential. So that's it. Please remember to like, comment, sub button, bell, Discord, Twitch, Twitter, links in the description. We should totally hang out sometime. My name's Joey Zero. Okay, bye.